There are moments in a man's life when everything looks exactly the way it's supposed to look. And that's precisely when you should be the most careful. I've been a doctor for 32 years. I've sat across from patients who smiled and told me they felt fine, and I've looked at their test results and seen something else entirely. I learned a long time ago that the surface of things and the truth underneath them are not always the same. I learned that in my office, with my patients. I just never thought I'd have to apply that same lesson inside my own home. My name is Walter Hale. I practiced family medicine in Clarkton, Tennessee for most of my adult life. It's a small town, the kind where people wave at you from their porches, where the diner on Main Street still has the same menu it had 20 years ago, where folks know your name and your father's name, and probably your grandfather's too. I delivered babies here. I held the hands of people taking their last breaths. I stitched up the Callaway boy after a farming accident and told Margaret Pruitt the news about her husband's heart that nobody wanted to hear. I was woven into this place, and this place was woven into me. I was 60 years old that October. 60 years old and 2 months away from retirement. Something I had been both looking forward to and quietly dreading in equal measure. The practice would go to Dr. Anita Webb, a young woman from Nashville who had joined me 2 years prior. She was good. Better than good. Clarkton would be in capable hands. I told myself I was ready. My wife, Carol, had passed 8 years before. Breast cancer. She was 53 years old, and she fought it the way she fought everything in her life. Quietly, stubbornly, without complaint. After she was gone, the house felt too large for one man. But I stayed. It was our home. It was the home where Owen had grown up, where he had taken his first steps in the hallway just off the kitchen, where he had sat at the dining room table doing homework while Carol stood at the stove. I couldn't leave it. Owen was our only child, 34 years old. He worked in real estate over in Knoxville, did reasonably well, from what I could tell. He had married Sandra 6 years prior. She was a nurse at the regional hospital, competent and composed, the kind of person who never seemed flustered. They had a son together, Liam, 4 years old, with Carol's eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. I loved that boy more than I can put into words. Owen and Sandra came to visit on a Saturday in early October. Nothing unusual about that. They came every few weeks, sometimes more often, as my retirement drew closer. I thought it was affection. I thought it was my son wanting to spend time with his father before the slower pace of retirement changed the rhythm of our lives. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. That Saturday was one of those Tennessee autumn days that make you feel like the world is exactly as it should be. The leaves on the old oak out front had gone deep red and gold. The air was cool and sharp and smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. Liam ran through the yard chasing a dog that belonged to the neighbors, shrieking with laughter, and I stood on the porch watching him with my coffee and felt something close to peace. Owen sat in the wooden rocking chair beside me. We talked about the weather, about Liam, about a property deal he was working on over in Knoxville. Normal conversation. Easy conversation. The kind fathers and sons have been having on porches since there were porches to sit on. Sandra was inside. I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the soft clatter of cups, the whistle of the kettle. She called out from behind the screen door and asked if we wanted tea. Owen said yes without looking up. I said that would be fine. She brought the tray out a few minutes later. 2 cups, a small pot, a dish with sugar and a jar of honey. She set it on the low table between our chairs, smiled at me in that composed, practiced way she had, and went back inside to be with Liam. Owen poured. He handed me my cup and kept the other for himself. I looked at the tea, steam rising slowly in the cool air. The color was right. The smell was right. Everything about it looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. And that was precisely when I felt it. That quiet shift somewhere behind my sternum that I had learned over 32 years of practice to never ignore. Not quite alarm, not quite certainty. Something older than both of those things. The instinct of a man who had spent 3 decades reading the space between what something appeared to be and what it actually was. I picked up the cup. I held it. I did not drink. Owen was talking. Something about a neighborhood in Knoxville, a market shift, an opportunity. I nodded. I watched the steam curl up from the surface of the tea. I thought about Sandra in the kitchen. I thought about the way she had set the tray down efficiently, without hesitation. The way you set something down when you've rehearsed it. I thought about the past few months. The questions Owen had been asking about my will. The questions Sandra had asked, casually, about the medication storage at my practice. The way both of them had been present more than usual as my retirement date approached. I had filed all of those things under love, under family, under my son wanting to be close to his father in the years ahead. Owen stood up suddenly. He said he'd forgotten to bring the honey inside from the car. He knew I liked it in my tea. He excused himself and walked down the porch steps toward the driveway. I looked at my cup, then I looked at his. I made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. A decision that required no deliberation, no reasoning, no weighing of options. My hands moved before my mind fully caught up with what I was doing. I switched the cups. Owen came back up the porch steps with a small jar of honey in his hand. He was smiling that easy, relaxed smile I had known his whole life. He settled back into the rocking chair, set the honey on the table, and picked up his cup without a second glance. I watched him add honey. I watched him stir. I watched him lift the cup to his lips and drink. I held my own cup and said nothing. We sat there for another few minutes, talking about nothing in particular. The light was shifting through the oak leaves. Liam's laughter floated in from somewhere in the yard. I kept my eyes forward and my breathing even, the way I had learned to do in examination rooms when delivering news that would change someone's life. You do not let your face say what your mind is thinking. You stay steady. You stay present. You wait. Owen set his cup down on the arm of the chair. He rubbed the back of his neck. Said he felt a little warm. I asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. Just tired from the drive, maybe. I said nothing. 7 minutes later, I know, because I was watching the hands of my watch, the way you watch a patient's vital signs. Owen's words began to slow. Not dramatically, not the way you see in movies. Subtly, the way a tide goes out. His sentences shortened. He lost the thread of what he was saying twice. He blinked several times in a row, and I recognized the particular quality of those blinks. Heavy, reluctant. The involuntary protest of a nervous system being chemically overridden. He turned to look at me. For just a moment. And I will carry that moment for the rest of my life. His eyes met mine with something in them that was not quite confusion and not quite recognition. Something in between. Something that passed as quickly as it came. Then he slumped forward in the chair. I caught him before he went sideways. I eased him back against the wood, checked his airway, checked his pulse. Both were fine. Whatever Sandra had used, she had known the dosage. She was a nurse. She would have known exactly how much would incapacitate without killing. This was not meant to be lethal. It was meant to make me compliant, confused, unable to resist whatever came next. I sat back in my own chair. I looked at my son's unconscious face, at the jaw I had watched square itself over the years, from a boy's soft face into a man's, at the hands folded in his lap, hands I had held crossing streets, hands I had bandaged after bicycle falls, hands I had shaken at his wedding 6 years ago. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I had thought, in the abstract way you sometimes think about worst-case scenarios, that if I ever discovered a betrayal this deep, I would fall apart. I did not fall apart. What I felt was something much quieter and much heavier than tears. It was the specific weight of a truth you have been carrying, without knowing it, suddenly making itself known in full. Sandra came out through the screen door a few minutes later. She was drying her hands on a dish towel, looking toward Owen's chair the way you look at something you expect to find a certain way. She found it a different way. Her eyes went to Owen, then to me. I was sitting calmly, both hands around my cup, looking at her with what I imagine was a fairly neutral expression. She stopped in the doorway. I said, "He seemed to get tired suddenly. You might want to call someone." The color left her face. She understood immediately. I could see the exact moment she understood, the slight parting of her lips, the stillness that replaced her composure, the way her eyes moved from Owen to the cups on the table and back to me. She was a medical professional. She did the calculation instantly. 2 cups, 1 unconscious person. And it was not me. She said his name. She went to him, checked his pulse the way I had, confirmed what she already knew. Then she straightened up and looked at me, and I saw something in her face that I had not expected. Not defiance, not anger. Something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. I did not press it. Not then. I told her calmly that she should get Owen inside and that we would not be discussing what had just happened on the front porch, where any neighbor walking by might see. She nodded. We got Owen inside between us and laid him on the couch in the living room. Liam had fallen asleep on the armchair nearby, one small hand tucked under his cheek. I stood in my own living room and looked at my sleeping grandson and my unconscious son, and my daughter-in-law who could not meet my eyes. And I understood that nothing about my life was what I had believed it to be. Sandra sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from her. Between us, the tea tray, still where she had left it. The honey jar, the 2 cups, one mine, one Owen's. I did not raise my voice. In 32 years of practice, I had learned that the quieter you speak, the more carefully people listen. I asked her what was in the tea. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she told me, a sedative, midazolam, drawn from a supply she had access to through the hospital. Enough to cause heavy sedation for 2 to 4 hours. Enough to make a 60-year-old man confused and cooperative. I asked her what was supposed to happen after I was sedated. She looked at the table. I asked again. She said Owen had paperwork, a power of attorney document, a transfer of the property deed, prepared by someone she didn't know who, she said. And I chose in that moment to believe her, though I wasn't certain. The plan was that while I was sedated, Owen would guide my hand. She said it quietly, those last 4 words, as if saying them quietly would reduce what they meant. Guide my hand. I had delivered babies with these hands. I had set broken bones and removed infected tissue and held the hands of the dying. My son had planned to use those hands, unconscious and unknowing, to sign away everything I had spent a lifetime building. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her the question that mattered most to me in that room. With the autumn light coming through the kitchen window and Liam asleep in the next room. I asked her how long this had been planned. She said several months. Owen had become agitated after I told him I was revising my will, that I intended to leave a substantial portion of the estate to the county medical fund and to a nursing scholarship in Carol's name, with the remainder divided between Owen and a trust for Liam's education. Owen had not taken that well. He had expected everything. He had been expecting everything for years, she said. And there was something in the way she said it that told me she had tried, at some point, to talk him out of this. That she had failed. That she had gone along anyway. I did not excuse her for that, but I filed it away. The thing about being a doctor in a small town for 32 years is that you become a repository of other people's pain. You learn where it comes from, how it moves, what it does to people over time. I had seen what unchecked want could do to a family. I had seen it in my patients' lives and in the lives of the families they described. I had just never expected to see it looking up at me from my own kitchen table. Owen stirred in the living room around the 2-hour mark, which was consistent with what Sandra had described.
I heard him before I saw him.
The particular sounds of someone returning to consciousness, disoriented and slow.
I went to the doorway.
He was sitting up on the couch, blinking at the ceiling. Then he looked at me, standing in the doorway of my own living room, arms at my sides, watching him. The expression that crossed his face in those first seconds of full awareness was something I could not have prepared myself for. It moved through confusion and into recognition, and then into something else, something calculating and quick, that he tried to cover almost immediately with a look of normalcy. "How are you, Dad?" he started to say. I must have dozed off. I told him I knew. 2 words. I said them the way I said difficult things to patients, plainly, without softening, because softening only prolongs the pain. He went very still. I told him I had switched the cups when he went to get the honey. I told him I had sat on that porch and watched the sedative take hold, and I had checked his airway and his pulse, and I had brought him inside. I told him I had spoken with Sandra. The room was quiet enough that I could hear Liam breathing from the armchair across the room. Owen looked at me for a long time. The calculating expression was gone. What replaced it, I still find difficult to name. It was not remorse, exactly. It was something rawer than remorse and emptier than regret. It was the look of a man who has been caught, not just in a plan, but in who he actually is. He said my name. Dad. Just that. I told him I needed him and Sandra to leave. I told him to take Liam and go back to Knoxville. I told him we would talk again when I had decided what came next. He started to say something more, started to explain, or apologize, or justify. I don't know which, because I held up one hand and he stopped. They left 20 minutes later. I stood at the front window and watched Owen carry a sleeping Liam to the car, buckle him into his seat, close the door gently. Watched Sandra get in without looking back at the house. Watched the car back out of the driveway and disappear down the road through the red and gold leaves. Then I sat down in the chair by the window, the chair where Carol used to read, and I stayed there until the sun went down. I thought about Carol that evening. I thought about what she would have said, sitting in that same chair, if I had come to her with this. She had always seen Owen more clearly than I had. Not harshly, Carol was never harsh with him, but clearly. She had said to me once, when Owen was maybe 19 or 20, that the boy had a hunger in him that she couldn't quite place. She hadn't meant it as a condemnation. She was his mother. She loved him. But she saw it. I had smiled and said all young men were hungry for something. And she had looked at me in that particular way she had, patient, a little sad, and let it go. She had been right. She had been right, and I had been too busy loving my son to look at him honestly. That was the thing that sat the heaviest with me as the sun went down and the room went dark around me. Not the plan, not the midazolam and the tea, or the forged documents, or the careful choreography of it all. What sat heaviest was the recognition that the signs had been there for years, and I had chosen, again and again, not to see them. A doctor who had spent his career reading what people couldn't say out loud had been willfully blind to what his own son had been showing him for a very long time. I didn't turn the lights on when dark came. I just sat there in Carol's chair, in the dark, in the quiet, and let the full weight of it settle into me the way you have to let hard things settle before you can decide what to do with them. I was 60 years old. I was 2 months from retirement. I was alone in a house that was too big for one man, in a town that trusted me, with a grandson I loved more than my own life, and a son who had just tried to drug me and steal everything I had. I stayed in that chair until the clock in the hallway struck 10. Then I got up, turned on the lamp, went to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. And I began to think about what came next. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, the same kind of legal pad I used when I was a resident, when I had to write everything down to make sense of it. And I started from the beginning. Not from that Saturday, further back than that. I went back as far as I could remember, and I wrote down every moment that had felt slightly off. Every conversation that had left a small residue of unease, every time I had noticed something and then deliberately looked away. It took me most of the night. By the time the sky outside began to lighten from black to gray, I had filled 11 pages. The first entry was from nearly 3 years prior. Owen had come to visit alone that time Sandra had stayed home with Liam, who was sick with a fever. We had dinner together, just the two of us, and afterward Owen had asked me, almost casually, whether I had updated my will since Carol passed. I told him I had done some revisions, but that it was not something I thought about often. He had nodded and let it go, and I had thought nothing of it beyond a son showing sensible interest in his family's affairs. I wrote it down. The second entry was from about 2 years back. Sandra had come with Owen that time, and she had asked to see my office at the practice. I had given her the tour. It was a natural enough request from a nurse, a collegial interest. But she had lingered in the medication storage room. She had asked about the lock. She had asked whether I kept a log of controlled substances. I had answered without thinking twice, proud of the orderly systems I had built over decades. I wrote it down. There were 9 more entries after those 2. Some small, some less small. A question here, an observation there. Owen asking whether I had considered a living trust instead of a will. Sandra mentioning, twice in 2 separate visits, that she had heard of families who had been left in difficult positions when a parent's health declined suddenly. Owen suggesting, with what had seemed like genuine concern, that I should consider putting certain assets jointly in his name just for ease of access. He'd said, just in case. Just in case. I had taken every single one of those moments and wrapped it in the warmest possible interpretation. Because he was my son. Because she was my daughter-in-law. Because Liam existed, and love for Liam made everything connected to his parents feel safe. I put the pen down and looked at those 11 pages, and I understood something that I think I had been circling for years without ever landing on it directly. The blindness had not been accidental. It had been a choice. Not a conscious choice, not a deliberate decision to deceive myself, but a choice nonetheless. Every time I had felt that small, quiet friction of something not quite right, I had made the choice to smooth it over. Because the alternative was too large and too dark to look at directly. A father who suspects his son is not who he appears to be has 2 options. He can look, or he can love. For years, I had chosen to love. I folded the legal pad in half and put it in the drawer beneath the kitchen counter. Then I went upstairs, changed my clothes, and drove to the diner on Main Street for breakfast. I ate eggs and toast and drank 2 cups of coffee and nodded to the people who said good morning. And nobody in that diner knew that my world had rearranged itself completely in the past 18 hours. That was a Sunday. On Monday, I went back to work. I saw 12 patients that day. A boy with strep throat, an elderly woman managing a new diabetes diagnosis, a farmer with a shoulder injury that was going to need more attention than I could give it before retirement. I moved through those appointments the way I had moved through 32 years of appointments, present, focused, careful. Whatever was happening in my personal life did not belong in that examination room. The people who sat across from me deserved my full attention, and they got it. But between patients, in the quiet minutes when I sat at my desk writing notes, I thought about Owen. I thought about the plan as Sandra had described it. Methodical, prepared. This was not an impulsive thing. This was not a desperate man making a reckless decision in a moment of pressure. This had been built over months, possibly longer, with deliberate steps and careful timing. The approach of my retirement had been a deadline for them, a window closing, after which my affairs would be more settled, my decisions more fixed, my documentation harder to alter. The more I turned it over, the more I understood that what I had witnessed on that porch was not the beginning of something. It was the execution of something that had been running in the background of my life for a very long time. That understanding changed things. It meant the threat was not over simply because the first attempt had failed. A plan this carefully constructed by a man this determined would not be abandoned after one setback. Owen had gone home to Knoxville. He had gone home knowing that I knew, and I had no way of predicting what he would do with that knowledge. I thought about that on the drive home from the practice that Monday evening. The leaves on the road were deeper orange than they had been the week before. The autumn moving forward the way autumn always does, indifferent to what was happening underneath it. I thought about the fact that I was 60 years old and alone, and that my son had tried to drug me, and that I had sent him away without calling the police. I had reasons for that. They were not irrational reasons, but sitting alone in the car on that road, I wondered if they were good enough reasons. I thought about Frank Colson. Frank and I had been friends since we were 15 years old. We had grown up 3 streets apart in Clarkton, gone to the same high school, played on the same baseball team the summer before our senior year. He had gone into law enforcement the way some men go into medicine, not because it was the most lucrative path, but because it was the only path that felt right. He had been with the county sheriff's department for 30 years, made detective 20 years ago, and was still there, still working, with no apparent intention of retiring anytime soon. We had lunch together every few weeks at the diner, talked about baseball and local politics, and the slow changes coming to Clarkton as the years went by. He knew Carol had passed. He knew Owen. He had been at Owen's wedding, sat at a table near the back, shook hands and said the right things. He was that kind of friend, present at the significant moments, steady in the ordinary ones. I called him Tuesday morning before I left for the practice. I told him I needed to talk. He heard something in my voice that I probably didn't intend to put there, because he didn't ask questions. He just said to come by his office at noon. I drove to the county building at lunchtime and sat across from Frank in his office, with its stacks of files and the old photograph of his father in uniform on the wall. And I told him everything. All of it. From the 11 pages on the legal pad, to the yellow light coming through the oak tree, to the sound of Owen's words slowing down like a clock running out of power. I told him about Sandra at the kitchen table, about the midazolam, about the power of attorney document, about the phrase, "guide my hand." Frank listened the way good investigators listen, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, with the kind of stillness that isn't passivity, but attention. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me 3 questions. He asked if I had retained the cups. I said no, I had washed them that evening without thinking, a habit of 30 years. He didn't reproach me for that. He asked if Sandra had given me the name of whoever had prepared the documents. I said she claimed not to know. He wrote something down. Then he asked me why I hadn't called it in immediately. I told him the truth. I told him that when you have loved someone for 34 years, when you held them the day they were born and watched them take their first steps and stood beside them at their wedding, you do not immediately reach for the phone. You sit in the dark for a while first. You give yourself time to absorb the shape of the thing before you decide what to do with it. Frank looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already understands about human nature. He told me he was going to make some inquiries. Quietly, carefully, without tipping anything over, before we had a clearer picture. He told me to go about my normal routine, to not contact Owen beyond what was natural, and to let him know immediately if anything changed. He also told me something that I had not thought of, but that I should have. He told me to change the locks on my house, and to consider whether there was anything in the practice, in my files or my medication storage, that needed to be secured differently. I drove back to the practice that afternoon and called the locksmith. The following week moved slowly. Owen sent a text message midweek, brief, careful in its tone, saying only that he hoped I was well and that he wanted to talk when I was ready. I did not respond immediately. I showed the message to Frank, who photographed it and added it to what he was building. Sandra called on Friday. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was measured and quiet, and said only that she was sorry, that she wanted me to know that, and that she understood if I needed time. I listened to it twice. Then I saved it and called Frank. He told me his preliminary inquiries had turned up something worth noting. The documents Owen had brought, or had intended to bring, appeared to have been prepared by a notary in Knoxville. Frank was working on identifying exactly who. He also told me, carefully, that Owen had made 2 calls to a private investigator in Knoxville in the past 3 weeks. He didn't elaborate on how he knew that. I sat with that information for the rest of the evening. A private investigator, Owen was watching me, or was preparing to watch me, which meant that the setback of the failed Saturday had not slowed him down. It had changed his approach. I began to understand that the situation was more serious than I had initially assessed. On the following Tuesday, I finished a full day at the practice, said goodnight to Dr. Webb and to my receptionist, Ruth, who had worked with me for 19 years and who gave me a hug on the way out the way she always did, and I walked to my car in the small parking lot behind the building. The drive home took 11 minutes on a normal day. I took the same route I had taken for years down Birch Street, left on County Road 12, past the Hendersons' farm with the white fence and the horse that always stood at the corner of the field. Then the long, straight stretch leading to my driveway. I got to the long, straight stretch, and then I didn't get home. There were 2 of them. I didn't see them until they were already at the car, one at the driver's window, one at the passenger side. They weren't aggressive in the way you might expect. No shouting, no visible weapons in that first moment. Just 2 men appearing from the roadside in the early dark, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done something like this before. The one at my window told me to pull over. His voice was flat, professional. I pulled over. They got in, one in the back, directly behind me, one in the passenger seat. The one in the passenger seat told me to keep driving and to follow the directions he gave me. I drove. My heart was steady, steadier than it had any right to be. I have thought about that since, why I wasn't more frightened in that moment. And I think it comes down to this. I had already absorbed the worst shock 3 days earlier, sitting on that porch, watching my son's words slow and stop. After you have survived the deepest thing, the secondary things have less power over you. They directed me off County Road 12 onto a smaller road I knew slightly. A gravel track that led back toward an area of scrubland and old storage buildings that had once been part of a lumber operation. The area had been abandoned for years. I had driven past the turnoff 1,000 times without ever going in. We stopped at a low concrete building set back from the track, half hidden by overgrown cedars. They got me inside. It was a single large room, bare concrete floor, 2 folding chairs, a work table against one wall, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Cold. The smell of old timber and rust and something chemical underneath it. They didn't hurt me. That was important to understand later. When I was describing it, they had no intention of hurting me physically. This was not that kind of operation. They took my phone. One of them made a call. Then they waited. Owen arrived about 40 minutes later. He came in alone, which surprised me. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of someone who hadn't slept, but the tiredness of someone carrying something heavy. He pulled the second folding chair to face mine and sat down, and looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said he was sorry it had come to this. I told him it didn't have to come to this. That it had come to this because he had made choices that led here, one after another. He said he knew that. He said he needed me to understand that this wasn't what he had wanted. That the original plan this Saturday, the tea, had been Sandra's idea as much as his. That it was supposed to be clean and simple. That nobody was supposed to get hurt. I listened to him say all of this. I did not believe most of it. But I listened. Then he put a folder on the table. The folder contained 3 documents. A power of attorney granting Owen full authority over my financial and medical decisions. A deed transfer for the property, the house, the land, everything. And a 3rd document I had to look at twice to understand fully. A letter, apparently written by me, addressed to Dr. Webb at my practice, stating that I was resigning my position immediately due to health concerns, and transferring all ownership of the practice's assets to Owen as my designated representative. He wanted me to sign all 3. I looked at the documents for a long time. Then I looked at Owen, at my son, sitting across from me in a cold concrete room in the dark Tennessee countryside, asking me to sign away my home and my life's work and my professional legacy. I asked him what he thought would happen after I signed, whether he believed I would simply go home and say nothing, whether he had thought that far ahead. He said that once the documents were filed, any accusation I made would look like the confusion of an elderly man who had willingly transferred his assets and then changed his mind. He said it with the precision of someone who had thought it through carefully, and I understood that someone had helped him construct that logic. A lawyer, possibly. Someone who understood how these things looked on paper. I told him I would not sign. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said there was one more thing he wanted me to see before I made my final decision. He stepped outside. He came back 2 minutes later, carrying Liam. The boy was asleep, wrapped in his blue blanket, his head against Owen's shoulder. Owen sat back down in the chair across from me, holding his sleeping son, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not threatening, not cold. Something more complicated and more painful than either of those things. He said he wanted me to think about Liam, about what all of this meant for Liam, about whether I wanted to put Liam through what would come next if I chose to fight this. And there it was. The last card, the one he had been saving. I looked at my grandson's sleeping face, at Carol's eyes, closed now, moving faintly beneath the lids the way children's eyes move in deep sleep, at the small fingers curled around the edge of the blue blanket. The room was very quiet. I thought about what Frank had told me before all of this began. I thought about the envelope I had left at the practice, tucked inside the false bottom of my desk drawer, addressed in my handwriting to Frank Colson, with instructions to open it if I failed to check in by Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning was less than 12 hours away. I told Owen I needed to think. He said I had until morning. Then he took Liam and left the room. And I was alone with the bare bulb and the cold and the smell of rust. Sitting in a folding chair in the dark Tennessee countryside, thinking about what love costs and what it's worth, and where exactly the line is between protecting someone and surrendering to the thing that is destroying them both. I have spent a lot of time, in the months since that night, thinking about what fear actually feels like when it is real. Not the small fears, the anxious hum before a difficult conversation, the tightness in the chest before bad news. I mean the deep kind, the kind that settles into the body like cold water and stays there. I was not afraid of Owen. I want to be clear about that. Sitting in that concrete room with the bare bulb overhead and the smell of rust and old timber in the air. I was not afraid of my son in the way you might expect a man to be afraid of someone who has had him brought to a place like that against his will. What I felt was something different, something that took me most of that long night to identify correctly. I was afraid of myself. More specifically, I was afraid of the part of myself that looked at those 3 documents on the table and felt, beneath all the anger and the grief and the clear-eyed recognition of what Owen had become, a pull. A small, terrible, almost imperceptible pull towards simply signing. Not because I agreed, not because I was beaten, but because signing would end it. Signing would mean no police, no courthouse, no newspaper story in the Clarkton Gazette about the town doctor and his son. Signing would mean I could watch Liam grow up. It would mean Owen stayed out of prison and Sandra kept her nursing license, and the Hale family remained, on the surface at least, intact. That pull frightened me more than the 2 men in my car and the concrete room and the forged documents combined. I recognized it for what it was. I had seen it before, not in myself, but in Patience. In the woman who stayed with the husband who frightened her because leaving meant dismantling the only life she knew. In the man who kept covering his brother's debts because cutting him off meant admitting the brother was not who he had believed him to be. The pull toward a bearable lie over an unbearable truth. I had counseled people through that pull for 32 years. I had sat across from them in my examination room and talked about the difference between peace and avoidance, between love and enablement. And here I was, alone in the dark, feeling exactly what they had felt. I got up from the folding chair and walked the length of the room. 4 steps one direction, 4 steps back. The concrete was uneven underfoot, and the single bulb cast a circle of yellow light that barely reached the walls. One of the 2 men was outside the door. I could hear him occasionally shift his weight on the gravel. The other, I assumed, was somewhere nearby. I thought about Carol. I had been thinking about her more than usual in those days, which made sense. She had always been the person I thought most clearly beside. Even after 8 years, the habit of turning toward her in the difficult moments had not fully left me. I thought about what she would have said in that room, and I knew, with the certainty I knew very few things, that she would not have told me to sign. Carol had a way of cutting through the complicated feelings to the simple truth underneath. She would have said something like, "Walter, the question isn't what's easiest. The question is what Liam grows up knowing about the people who raised him." And that was it. That was the thing that settled it for me, standing in that cold room in the dark. If I signed those documents, Owen got everything he wanted. The house, the land, the practice assets, the financial accounts. He got all of it. And then he went back to Knoxville and raised Liam in the knowledge, conscious or not, that this was how the world worked. That patience and manipulation and the willingness to do whatever was necessary were the tools a man used to get what he wanted. That a grandfather's love was a weakness to be exploited rather than a gift to be honored. I was not going to give Liam that inheritance. Not the money, the lesson. I went back to the chair and sat down. I folded my hands together and I breathed slowly and steadily, the way I had taught patients to breathe when they needed to get through something difficult. And I waited. Around what I estimated to be 2 in the morning, I had no watch, no phone, no way to know precisely. One of the men came in with a paper cup of coffee and set it on the table, without a word. I drank it. It was bad coffee, weak and slightly stale. But it was warm, and I was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for small, ordinary things when ordinary things have become scarce. I thought about Frank. I thought about the envelope in the desk drawer. I had written it 4 days earlier, on the Thursday before that Saturday when Owen and Sandra came with the tea. Not because I had known what was coming. I hadn't known, not with certainty. But I had felt the approach of something. The way you sometimes feel a weather change before the sky shows it. A doctor's intuition, or a father's dread, or simply the accumulated weight of 11 pages of things I had been choosing not to see. I wasn't sure which, but I had written the letter, and I had sealed it, and I had put it where Frank would find it if he needed to. The letter told him everything I had told him in his office, and a few things more. It told him about the questions Owen had asked about the will. It told him about Sandra and the medication storage. It told him that if he was reading it, something had gone wrong, and he should look at Owen first and ask questions after. It also told him where I kept the spare key to the practice. And it told him to check the locked drawer in my desk, where I had placed, on that same Thursday evening, a small digital recorder containing a full account of what Sandra had told me at the kitchen table. I had not told Frank about the recorder when I met with him. I had wanted to, but something had held me back. Some instinct that said, keep one thing back. Keep one piece that nobody else knows about. Because you don't know yet how this will unfold, and you may need something in reserve. Wednesday morning. Frank would open the envelope Wednesday morning if I hadn't checked in. I sat in that room and I calculated the hours, and I told myself to hold on. Dawn came slowly to that place. I knew it was coming before I could see it. A gradual softening of the darkness at the single high window near the ceiling. A shift from black to the particular deep blue of very early morning. I had not slept. I had sat in the chair or walked the room or stood still with my eyes closed, breathing, waiting. My back ached from the folding chair and my mouth was dry, and I was hungry in the distant, manageable way that you are hungry when hunger is the least of your concerns. Owen came back around 7 in the morning. He looked worse than he had the night before. There were shadows under his eyes and a tightness around his jaw that I recognized. It was the look of a man who had spent the night trying to convince himself that what he was doing was justified and had not entirely succeeded. He sat down across from me without the folder this time. He just sat there for a moment, looking at his hands. He asked me if I had thought about what he said. I told him I had thought about very little else. He asked me if I understood that he didn't want to hurt me. That this was never about hurting me. That all he had ever wanted was to know that his family would be taken care of. That Liam would be taken care of. That he wouldn't spend his life watching everything his father had built get parceled out to county funds and scholarship committees, while his own son grew up without the security that money could provide. I listened to all of it. I let him say every word of it without interrupting. And when he was finished, I told him something that I had been thinking about since somewhere around 3 in the morning. sitting in the dark with the cold coming up through the concrete floor. I told him that I understood where the hunger came from. I told him that I had not been a perfect father, that after Carol died I had buried myself in the practice, in a way that left Owen more alone than I had recognized at the time. That grief does things to a man that he doesn't always see clearly until later. That I was sorry for the years when I had been present in this town, for everyone except the person in my own house who needed me most. Owen went very still. I told him that none of that excused what he had done. That understanding where something comes from is not the same as accepting it. That a man at 34 years old is responsible for his choices, regardless of what shaped him. And that the choices Owen had made over the past several months were choices I could not and would not pretend had not happened. He said my name again. Dad. The same way he had said it on the porch. Sitting up on the couch with the sedative clearing from his system. Just that one word, carrying more weight than any sentence he had spoken. I told him I was not going to sign the documents. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Owen stood up and walked to the window, the high, narrow window near the ceiling, and stood there with his back to me, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at the pale morning light. He stood there for a long time. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something shifted in his posture, a sudden tensing, a quick recalibration. He said something under his breath that I couldn't make out. Then he looked at me with an expression that had changed completely from the one he'd come in with. The tiredness and the complicated grief were gone. What replaced them was something harder and more focused. He said he needed a few minutes. He went outside. I heard voices, Owen's voice and one of the other men's, quick and low. I couldn't make out the words. Then footsteps moving away from the building. Then a car engine, somewhere in the distance. Then, after a silence of perhaps 5 minutes, a different sound entirely. More than one vehicle coming fast up the gravel track. The particular sound of car doors opening and closing in rapid sequence. The kind of sequence that means more than two people and a purpose. Then, Frank Coulson's voice. Outside, clear and authoritative, calling Owen's name. I sat in my folding chair in that cold, concrete room, and I put both hands flat on my knees, and I breathed out, slowly. It was Wednesday morning. Frank had opened the envelope. What followed happened quickly and also, in my memory, very slowly, the way significant moments always seem to occupy two different speeds at once. The door came open. Frank came in first, in his jacket and his sheriff's department badge, followed by two uniformed officers. He looked at me for a moment, at the folding chair and the bare bulb and the paper cup of bad coffee, and something moved across his face that was not quite anger and not quite relief, but contained elements of both. He said, "Walter, you all right?" I told him I was fine, a little stiff from the chair. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Owen was taken into custody outside the world. I didn't see it happen. Frank had me stay inside until the immediate situation was under control. But I heard it. I heard Owen's voice outside, and I heard the particular sound of resistance giving way to inevitability. And then I heard nothing more from him. Sandra was picked up at their home in Knoxville within the hour, Frank told me later. She did not resist. A neighborhood Liam Owen had arranged that before coming to the concrete building, which was the one thing he had done in all of this that I was grateful for. Liam had not been there for any of it. He was safe. Frank drove me home himself. We didn't talk much on the way. There wasn't much to say that the morning hadn't already said for us. He pulled into my driveway and stopped, and we sat there for a moment with the engine running, the red and gold oak out front catching the early light. He asked me again if I was all right. I told him I didn't know yet. that I thought I would be, eventually. That right now, I was just a man sitting in a driveway, trying to remember what normal felt like. Frank put his hand on my shoulder for a moment. Then he took it away and said he'd be in touch later in the day. I went inside. I went to the kitchen. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove and stood there waiting for it to boil, looking out the window at the backyard, where the light was coming through the last of the autumn leaves, gold and slow and indifferent to everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. I made a cup of tea. I stood at the counter and I drank it. And for a few minutes, I let myself feel nothing at all. The days after Frank brought me home were quiet in a way that felt wrong. I have lived alone for 8 years. I know what quiet sounds like in that house, the particular quality of it, the way it settles into the rooms in the evening, the way it sits differently in winter than in summer. I was accustomed to quiet. But the quiet that followed Owen's arrest was a different thing entirely. It had a texture to it, a weight. It was the quiet of a house where something large had happened, and the walls had not yet figured out how to hold it. I went back to work on Thursday, 2 days after Frank brought me home. I put on my coat and drove to the practice and saw my patients. Ruth looked at me when I came in, the way Ruth had been looking at me for 19 years. Reading my face the way a long-time colleague reads a face, taking in more than most people would notice. She didn't ask questions. She just made sure my coffee was ready and my schedule was clear of anything that could wait. I was grateful for that. I was grateful for a lot of small things in those days. Frank came by the practice on Thursday afternoon, after my last appointment. He sat in the patient chair across from my desk, the same chair where I had delivered difficult news to so many people over the years. And he walked me through where things stood. Owen had been charged with kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal coercion. The 2 men who had intercepted my car had been identified and were cooperating with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges. The notary in Knoxville who had prepared the fraudulent documents had been located. Frank said the case was solid. He said it with the careful confidence of a man who had built cases for 30 years and knew the difference between solid and merely hopeful. Sandra had been charged separately criminal conspiracy and illegal procurement of a controlled substance, specifically the midazolam. Frank told me that she had asked, through her attorney, whether I would be willing to speak with the prosecutor about her level of cooperation. She had provided detailed information about the timeline of the plan, about Owen's contacts, about the notary and the private investigator. She had not held anything back, as far as Frank could tell. I told Frank I would think about it. He nodded and wrote something in his notebook, and didn't press me further. After he left, I sat at my desk for a while. The practice was empty. Ruth had gone home. Dr. Webb had finished her afternoon rounds. The building had that particular end-of-day stillness that I had always found peaceful. The light through the blinds was the low amber of late October afternoon. I thought about Sandra. I had been thinking about her differently since the kitchen table conversation, since she had told me what was in the tea, since she had looked at her hands and answered my questions with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a thing too long and is relieved, in some terrible way, to finally put it down. She had done wrong. She had done serious, deliberate wrong. I was not going to pretend otherwise. But I also believed that the Sandra who had left that voicemail, that quiet, measured, "I'm sorry. I want you to know that was not performing." Some people perform remorse. I had seen enough of both kinds to know the difference. What I kept coming back to, sitting in my office in the amber light, was Liam. Liam was 4 years old. He did not know where his father was. He did not know why his mother was not at home. He was staying, Frank had told me, with Sandra's sister in Knoxville, a woman named Patricia, whom I had met twice at family gatherings. a steady and sensible person from what I could recall. Liam was safe and cared for. But he was also 4 years old, and the world had shifted under him without explanation, and he had no way of understanding why. I thought about that every day. It sat beside everything else: the legal proceedings, the statements I was being asked to provide, the calls from the county attorney's office. It sat beside all of it, like a smaller, quieter weight that never quite left. On Friday evening, I drove to Knoxville. I had called Patricia the day before. She had been cautious on the phone at first, understandably so, given everything. But I had explained simply that I was Liam's grandfather and that I wanted to see him. And something in her voice had shifted. She gave me the address. The drive to Knoxville took just under an hour. I made it as the sun was going down, the highway cutting through hills that had gone mostly bare now, the last of the color draining out of the trees with the October light. I drove without the radio. I needed the quiet. Patricia met me at the door. She was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, with Sandra's composure, but a warmth that Sandra had always kept more carefully contained. She looked at me for a moment, taking my measure, I suppose, the way you take the measure of someone who is connected to a situation that has upended your life. And then she stepped back and let me in. Liam was in the living room. He was on the floor with a set of wooden blocks, building something that appeared to be a tower of considerable ambition. He looked up when I came in, and for a moment, he just looked at me. The particular assessing look that 4-year-olds have, frank and uncomplicated. And then he said, "Grandpa," and went back to his blocks. I sat down on the floor beside him. We built that tower together for the better part of an hour. He directed the operation with great seriousness, instructing me on which blocks went where, correcting my placement with the patient authority of someone who has a clear vision and no tolerance for deviation. I followed his directions. The tower got taller. Eventually, it fell, the way towers do. And Liam laughed the laugh that could fill a room, and we started again. Patricia brought me coffee and sat in the armchair nearby, and we talked quietly while Liam played. She told me he had been asking for his mother every day, that he was confused but not frightened. Children that age, she said, could tolerate more uncertainty than adults expected, as long as the people around them remained steady. She had been steady. I told her I could see that, and that I was grateful. I stayed for 2 hours. When I got up to leave, Liam hugged my leg with both arms. The full body hug that small children give, uncalculated and total. And I stood there in Patricia's living room in Knoxville, with my hand on my grandson's back. And I made a decision that I had probably been working toward since the moment I sat down in that folding chair in the concrete room. I was not going to let this child grow up without someone in his corner who loved him without condition or agenda. Whatever happened next, whatever the courts decided, whatever sentences were handed down, Liam was going to know, his grandfather, I was going to make sure of that. The weeks that followed were filled with the particular bureaucratic weight of a legal process that moves both faster and slower than you expect. There were statements to give, documents to review, meetings with the county attorney, whose name was Marsh, a careful, methodical man in his 40s who reminded me slightly of a younger Frank. There were calls from Owen's defense attorney that I did not return. There was a call from Owen himself, from the county jail, that I did not return either. I want to be honest about that. I have asked myself more than once whether I should have taken that call. Whether a father owes his son a conversation, even in those circumstances. I don't have a clean answer. What I know is that I was not ready, and I had learned over 60 years that doing a difficult thing before you are ready for it rarely produces anything useful for either person involved. Frank kept me informed as things developed. The 2 men who had taken me off the road both with prior records, both hired through a connection Owen had made through his real estate work in Knoxville, had provided statements that corroborated everything. The notary, a man named Gerald Hoyt, had confirmed that Owen had commissioned the fraudulent documents and had paid him in cash over 2 separate meetings. The private investigator Owen had hired had also been interviewed. It turned out his role had been to document my daily routine, my route to and from the practice, my habits, my schedule, in order to identify the best opportunity for the interception. 11 minutes. The drive from my practice to my house took 11 minutes on a normal day. Owen had known that. He had known exactly where I would be and when. Gerald Hoyt had known. The private investigator had known. 2 hired men had known. And I had driven that road every day for years, without a thought. There is something specific about learning the full architecture of a plan that was built around your life. It is different from the general knowledge that someone meant you harm. It is the detail that does something to you. The detail of the private investigator's photographs of my car in the parking lot. The detail of the cash payments to a notary. The detail of Owen checking his phone in that concrete room and recalibrating when he realized the envelope had been opened. Each detail is a brick in a structure that was built, carefully and over time, specifically around you. And standing inside that structure, looking at how it was made, does something to a man that is hard to describe and harder to recover from. I kept going to work. I kept seeing my patients. I kept driving down Birch Street and left on County Road 12. Past the Hendersons' farm with the white fence and the horse at the corner. I did not take a different route. I thought about it. Frank had suggested it, mildly, but I decided against it. Taking a different route felt like letting the plan reshape my life, even after it had failed. And I was not willing to give it that. On a Tuesday in early November, I had a conversation with Attorney Marsh that I had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. He told me the prosecution was prepared to offer Sandra a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for her full testimony against Owen and against Gerald Hoyt. He asked me, as the primary victim, whether I had any objection to that arrangement. I sat with the question for a long moment. Then I told him I had no objection, that if Sandra's cooperation helped establish the full truth of what had happened, I thought that served the interests of justice better than a symmetrical punishment that ignored the difference between the person who built the plan and the person who was persuaded to participate in it. I told him I believed she had been genuinely remorseful. I told him I also believed remorse did not eliminate responsibility, and that whatever reduced sentence she received should still carry real consequence. Marsh wrote it all down. He thanked me for my clarity. I told him it had taken me several weeks to arrive at it. I drove to Knoxville to see Liam 3 more times in November. Each visit followed roughly the same shape. Walks on the floor, coffee with Patricia, a conversation about how Liam was doing that was both reassuring and quietly heartbreaking. He had stopped asking for his mother every day, Patricia told me on the 3rd visit. He had settled into a routine. He seemed happy enough in the moment, the way small children can seem happy enough in the moment, even when something is missing. But sometimes, Patricia said, he would stop in the middle of playing and look at the door. Just look at it for a few seconds, then go back to whatever he had been doing. I thought about that a great deal on the drive home. December came. The bare trees along County Road 12 went from copper gray to silver gray as the cold deepened. I began the process of officially retiring from the practice. The paperwork, the patient notifications, the transfer of records to Dr. Webb. Ruth cried on her last day, which made me cry, which surprised me, since I had believed I was fairly well cried out by that point. Turns out there are different kinds of tears, and they come from different places, and the well does not empty the way you think it will. My last day at the practice was a Wednesday in the middle of December. I saw my last patient, Margaret Pruitt's daughter, bringing her own daughter in for an ear infection, the third generation of that family I had treated. And when they left, I sat at my desk in the quiet and looked around the room. The diplomas on the wall, the photograph of Carol on the corner of the desk, the patient chair, the window with the bare oak branches moving in the December wind. 32 years. I turned the lights off and locked the door and gave the key to Dr. Webb, who was waiting in the hallway, with the particular expression of someone receiving something they know is significant. We shook hands. She said something kind that I have mostly forgotten, but felt fully in the moment. Then I walked out to my car. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Then I drove home. The preliminary hearing was held on a Thursday in January, in the Knox County Courthouse, a large sandstone building on a corner downtown that I had been inside only once before, years ago, for something unremarkable that I could no longer recall. I drove up alone. Frank had offered to come with me, but I told him I preferred to go by myself. Some things you need to face on your own terms. I sat in the gallery and watched Owen be brought in. He was in a suit his attorney had dressed him carefully, the way defense attorneys do, to humanize and contextualize. He looked thinner than I remembered. His hair had been cut recently. He sat at the defense table and did not look toward the gallery, at least not at first. Then he did. Our eyes met across that room. My son and I, looking at each other across the formal architecture of a courthouse, in a proceeding that existed because of choices he had made and choices I had made. His choices to do what he did. My choice to not look away from it. I held his gaze for a moment. I did not look away first. I am not entirely sure what my expression conveyed, and I am not entirely sure it matters. What matters is that I was there, present, not hiding from it, and not performing anything. Just there. He looked away first. The hearing itself was procedural, charges formally read, pleas entered, dates set. Owen's attorney entered a not guilty plea, which surprised no one. The date for trial was set for late March. I drove back to Clarkton in the gray January afternoon and stopped at the diner on Main Street and ate a bowl of soup and read the newspaper and let the ordinary rhythms of ordinary life settle back around me. Frank met me there. As it happened, he came in for coffee about the time I was finishing my soup, saw me, and sat down across from me without being asked. We talked for about an hour, not about the case, mostly, about the baseball season coming up, about a new family that had moved into the old Hendricks place on Maple Street, about how the diner had apparently changed its pie recipe and how the change was not an improvement. At some point, Frank said, without looking up from his coffee, that I was handling all of this remarkably well for a man whose world had been turned inside out. I told him I didn't know about remarkably well. I told him I was handling it the only way I knew how, which was one day at a time and without too much looking ahead. He nodded. He said that was probably the right approach. Then he said there was something he wanted to tell me. He said that in the course of the investigation, certain financial records had come to light. Owen's financial records. And what they showed was that Owen had not been doing reasonably well in real estate, as I had believed. He had been struggling significantly for nearly 2 years. There were debts, substantial ones. Business debts and personal debts, accumulated through a combination of poor decisions and what appeared to be a period of compulsive gambling that Owen had apparently concealed from everyone, including Sandra. I sat with that for a moment. It did not change what Owen had done. I want to be clear about that. It did not alter the wrongness of it by a single degree. But it added something to the picture, a dimension I had not had. The hunger that Carol had seen in our son all those years ago had apparently found a channel, and that channel had led him somewhere dark and desperate before it led him to my front porch with a plan and a cup of tea. I did not feel sorry for Owen in the way that diminishes accountability, but I felt something for him, something that was neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but existed in the complicated territory between the two. The territory that parents live in when their children become people they do not fully recognize. I drove home from the diner as the January dark was coming down, the heater running in the car, the road familiar under my headlights. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a moment before going inside. Then I went in, made dinner, and called Patricia to ask how Liam was doing. She said he had learned a new word that week.
Magnificent.
He had heard it somewhere. A cartoon, she thought, and he had been applying it to everything. The blocks were magnificent. The cereal was magnificent. The dog next door was, apparently, particularly magnificent. I laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and it surprised me a little with its warmth. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The house was quiet around me, the familiar quiet, not the wrong kind, not the weighted kind. Just the ordinary quiet of a winter evening in a house that had seen a great deal of living. I thought about the months ahead, the trial, the testimony I would have to give. The moment I would have to stand in that courthouse and say, in front of a jury and a judge and my own son, what had happened on that October afternoon on my porch and in the days that followed. I was not looking forward to it, but I was not afraid of it either. I had switched 2 cups on a porch in October and watched the truth reveal itself. I had sat in a cold room through a long night and held on until morning. I had driven to Knoxville and sat on a floor with a 4-year-old and built towers out of wooden blocks. Whatever came next, I had already done the hardest parts, or so I believed. The trial began on a Tuesday in late March, when the first real warmth of spring was just beginning to soften the edges of the Tennessee cold. I drove to Knox County in the early morning, the sky still pale and the roads quiet, and I parked in the courthouse lot and sat in my car for a few minutes before going in. I had been told what to expect. Attorney Marsh had walked me through the process carefully, the order of witnesses, the nature of the questions I would be asked, the likelihood of cross-examination by Owen's defense attorney, a man named Briggs who had a reputation for being methodical and thorough. Marsh told me to answer simply and directly, to not volunteer information beyond what was asked, and to take my time. He said I would be one of the first witnesses called. I had spent the previous evening at home, reading. Not about the trial, just reading a novel I had been meaning to get to for months. Sitting in Carol's chair by the lamp. It was the most normal evening I had managed in a long time, and I was grateful for it. The courtroom was larger than I expected. High ceilings, dark wood, the particular institutional solemnity of a place where serious things are decided. There were people in the gallery more than I had anticipated. Some I recognized from Clarkton, which unsettled me slightly. Small towns follow their own, for better and worse. Owen was brought in. He looked better than he had at the preliminary hearing, steadier, more composed. His attorney Briggs sat beside him, a gray-haired man with the unhurried manner of someone who had been in courtrooms long enough that they no longer impressed him. Sandra was not present in the courtroom for the trial. She had already entered her plea and agreed to testify for the prosecution. Her sentencing would come later. I was called to the stand mid-morning. I took the oath. I sat down. I looked out at the courtroom, at the jury of 12 people who were going to hear this story and make a decision about it. At Attorney Marsh standing at the podium with his careful, methodical manner. At Frank sitting near the back of the gallery in his jacket. At the empty row where no family sat because there was no family left to sit there. And at Owen, at the defense table, looking at me. Marsh began with the straightforward questions. My name, my occupation, my relationship to the defendant. I answered each one plainly. Then he moved to October, to the Saturday visit, to the porch and the tea tray and the 2 cups. I told it the way it happened, plainly, in sequence, without embellishment. I described what I had noticed and what I had decided and what I had done. I described watching Owen's words slow and stop. I described Sandra at the kitchen table. I described the phrase, "guide my hand," and watched 2 members of the jury react to it. A slight flinch, a pressing together of lips. And I noted that reaction, the way I noted things in examination rooms, without comment and without judgment. Then Marsh asked me to describe the events of the following Tuesday evening. I described them. The drive home. The 2 men at my car. The concrete building. The folder on the table. The 3 documents. I described Owen bringing Liam into that room. And I saw something shift in the jury, not just in 1 or 2 of them this time, but in most of them. The particular shift that happens when people hear something that clarifies, in a single image, exactly what kind of situation they are dealing with. I told them I had refused to sign. Marsh thanked me and sat down. Briggs stood up. He was courteous and careful in his cross-examination, probing for inconsistencies in my timeline, asking me to confirm certain details about the cups, asking whether I had any prior reason to suspect Owen before that Saturday. I answered each question honestly. When he asked me whether it was possible that Owen had been unaware of what Sandra had put in the tea, I told him that was not consistent with what I had observed, that Owen's behavior before, during, and after the event indicated full knowledge and coordination. Briggs noted my answer and moved on. When he was finished, I was excused. I walked back to my seat in the gallery. I did not look at Owen as I passed. Not out of anger. I had made a deliberate decision about that I would not perform anything in that courtroom. Not grief, and not anger, and not forgiveness. That I would simply be a man telling the truth about what had happened to him, and that the truth would be enough. The truth was enough. Sandra testified the following day. I was not in the courtroom for her testimony. I had been advised that my presence might complicate things, and I agreed with the reasoning. Frank gave me a summary afterward. She had been composed, he said, clear and detailed and consistent. She had described the full timeline of the plan, Owen's deteriorating financial situation, the gambling debts, the escalating desperation that had turned a vague resentment about the will into a methodical scheme. She had cried once, Frank said, when describing the moment she had carried the tea tray out to the porch. She had known, in that moment, that it was wrong. She had done it anyway. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on all counts. I was at home when Frank called me with the verdict. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, standing at the counter in the afternoon light. He read me the counts and the findings, one by one, in his steady, measured voice. When he finished, there was a silence between us that was not uncomfortable, just full. The kind of silence that follows the resolution of something that has occupied a great deal of space for a long time. I thanked him. He said that was what he was there for. After I hung up, I stood at the counter for a moment. The coffee had finished brewing. I poured a cup and stood there holding it, looking out the window at the backyard. The trees were just beginning to come back, the first faint green of early April showing at the branch tips of the oak, tentative and small and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it over the past 6 months. I drank my coffee. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had anticipated relief, or release, or some version of resolution that had a clear emotional shape. What I felt instead was quieter and more complicated than any of those things. It was the feeling of a door closing on a room you have spent a long time in, a room you did not choose, that you did not want to be in, but that has nonetheless become familiar. The door closes, and you are standing in the hallway, and the hallway is quiet, and you are not entirely sure yet what room comes next. I finished the coffee. Then I went to the phone and called Patricia and asked if I could come to Knoxville on Saturday to see Liam. She said, of course. She said he had been asking about me. I said I would be there at 10. Sentencing came on a Friday in early May. I drove to Knox County for the second time in 6 weeks. Along the same highway, through the same hills, but the hills looked different in May than they had in March. The trees were fully green now. The kind of deep, settled green that comes after the tentative first growth has had time to establish itself. The sky was wide and blue, and the morning was warm enough that I drove with the window down a little. The air coming in, carrying the particular smell of Tennessee spring, cut grass and red dirt, and something flowering somewhere that I couldn't identify, but that I associated, for reasons I couldn't trace, with my boyhood. I had been thinking about boyhood a lot in those weeks. About Owen's boyhood specifically. About the particular Saturday mornings when he was 7 or 8 years old, and we would drive out to the property, the land my father had left me. 20 acres of fields and old-growth timber on the eastern edge of town, and walk the fence lines together. Owen had loved those mornings. He had peppered me with questions the way small boys do, about the trees and the soil, and why the creek ran one direction and not the other. And I had answered every question as carefully and honestly as I could, the way I believed a father should. I had believed, on those mornings, that I was building something, that the hours we spent walking those fields were going into the foundation of something solid and lasting between us. I thought about that on the highway, with the window down and the spring air coming in. I thought about it without bitterness, which surprised me a little. The bitterness had been there. It had been there in full measure in the weeks after October, but it had done what bitterness eventually does if you don't feed it. It had diminished. Not disappeared, but diminished to the point where other things could exist alongside it. What existed alongside it now was grief. Clean grief, without the contamination of anger or the distortion of disbelief. Just the plain, clear sadness of a man who had loved his son and lost him in a way that had nothing to do with death, but felt, in its finality, not entirely unlike it. The courtroom was quieter at sentencing than it had been at trial. Fewer people in the gallery. Frank was there. Ruth, my former receptionist, had come. I had not expected that, and it moved me when I saw her sitting 2 rows back, her hands folded in her lap, her expression the same steady and present expression she had brought to 19 years of work beside me. I nodded to her. She nodded back. Owen's attorney had submitted letters of mitigation, character references, documentation of the gambling treatment program Owen had apparently enrolled in while awaiting trial, a psychological evaluation that described a pattern of compulsive behavior exacerbated by financial pressure and unresolved grief following his mother's death. I had read the summary that Marsh provided me. I had read it twice, carefully, the way I read everything that mattered. The grief following his mother's death. Carol had been gone for 8 years. Owen had been 26 when she died. I had known that her death had hit him hard. Harder, in some ways, than I had fully registered at the time. Because I had been absorbed in my own grief, and in the demands of a busy practice, and in the particular numbness that follows loss, and makes everything simultaneously urgent and unreal. I had not sat with Owen long enough in those first years. I had not asked the right questions. I had assumed that because he seemed to be functioning, working, dating Sandra, building a life, he was managing. Doctors make the worst patients. I wonder sometimes if we also make the worst grieving fathers. We are so accustomed to assessing and intervening and problem-solving that we miss the thing that doesn't present itself as a problem. The thing that just sits there quietly in a person for years, accumulating. I am not excusing him. I have said that before, and I will say it again because it is important and because the distinction matters. Understanding is not excusing. Compassion is not absolution. What Owen had done had been deliberate and calculated and had caused real harm. And the law was right to hold him accountable for it. But understanding where it came from, the hunger Carol had identified, the grief that had gone unaddressed, the debts and the desperation, and the long descent from a vague resentment to a concrete plan. Understanding all of that did not make me an apologist for my son. It made me a father. A father who had failed in some ways and been failed in others, and who was sitting in a courthouse in May trying to hold both of those truths at once, without letting either one erase the other. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Harrington, composed and precise, with the particular manner of someone who has presided over a great deal of human suffering and has learned to hold it without being hardened by it. She reviewed the sentencing guidelines, acknowledged the mitigation submissions, and noted the severity of the crimes: kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, criminal coercion, the involvement of a minor, even peripherally, as an instrument of emotional manipulation. She read that last part in a tone that was level, but that carried something underneath it. Owen stood for sentencing. His back was to me. I watched the set of his shoulders, the same shoulders I had watched as a small boy walking ahead of me along the fence lines, as a teenager shooting baskets in the driveway, as a young man walking away from me into his own life. 12 years. The judge handed down 12 years, with eligibility for parole consideration after 8, contingent on continued participation in the treatment program and demonstrated rehabilitation. 12 years. Owen's shoulders moved slightly when she said it. A single, small movement. Not a flinch exactly, more like a breath released. Then he was still again. I sat in my row and I did not move, and I did not look away. Sandra received 18 months in a minimum security facility, credit for time served, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and permanent revocation of her nursing license. She was in the courtroom for her own sentencing, which came immediately after Owen's. When the judge read her sentence, she closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and nodded, once, as if confirming something she had already made her peace with. As she was being let out, she turned, briefly, toward the gallery. She found my face. She held it for 2 or 3 seconds, long enough to be intentional, not long enough to be anything more than what it was: an acknowledgement. I returned it with the same steadiness. That was all. It was enough. I stayed in my seat until most of the gallery had emptied. Frank waited for me in the aisle. When I stood up, he fell into step beside me, and we walked out together into the May morning, the wide blue sky and the warm air and the sound of traffic on the street outside the courthouse. We stood on the steps for a moment. Frank said 12 years was right. I said I thought so too. He said the case had been one of the cleaner ones he'd been involved in terms of the evidence, and one of the harder ones in terms of everything else. I said that was an accurate description. Then he asked me what I was going to do now. I told him I had a call to make. I told him I was going to drive home. And then I was going to call Patricia. And then I was going to begin the process of applying for legal guardianship of Liam. Frank looked at me for a moment. Something moved in his face, something that in a less reserved man would have been a full expression. But in Frank was just a slight softening around the eyes and a brief compression of his lips. He said he thought that was the right thing. I said I thought so too. I shook his hand. Then I walked down the courthouse steps into the May morning and got into my car and began the drive back to Clarkton. The highway unrolled ahead of me through the green hills, the window down, the spring air coming in. I thought about Liam on the floor with his wooden blocks, applying the word magnificent to everything within reach. I thought about Carol in her chair by the window. I thought about the porch in October and the 2 cups of tea and the 4 seconds it had taken me to make a decision that had changed everything. I thought about what it means to be a father. Not in the abstract, not the version of fatherhood that exists in principle, in intention, in the love you feel before the complications arrive. I mean the real version. The version that includes the fence line walks and the homework at the kitchen table, and also the yellow legal pad at 2 in the morning, and the folding chair in the concrete room, and the courthouse in May. The version that asks more of you than you knew you had to give, and then asks more still. I was 60 years old. I was retired. I was driving home through the green Tennessee hills on a warm Friday in May. And somewhere in Knoxville, a 4-year-old boy was building towers out of wooden blocks. And I was going to call his aunt and begin the process of bringing him home. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The guardianship process took 3 months. I had expected it to be complicated, and in some ways it was. But the complications were mostly paperwork and waiting, which are the 2 things that legal processes do best. Attorney Marsh referred me to a family law attorney named Catherine Bowles, a woman in her late 40s who practiced out of an office on the 2nd floor of a building on State Street in Knoxville, with a window that looked out over a small park where people walked dogs in the morning. I liked her immediately. She had the same quality Frank had, a steadiness, an absence of performance, and she explained the process to me plainly and without false reassurance. She told me that because both parents were alive, the guardianship petition would require the court to find that the parents were unfit or unable to provide adequate care. Given the circumstances Owen's incarceration, Sandra's pending imprisonment, the nature of the crimes, she said the evidentiary threshold would not be difficult to meet. What would take time was the home study, the background checks, the court-appointed guardian ad litem who would be assigned to represent Liam's interests independently. I told her I understood. I told her to proceed. Patricia had agreed, in the interim, to continue caring for Liam. She had done this without hesitation, which told me everything I needed to know about her character. She had also, quietly and without being asked, begun gathering documentation of Liam's daily life in her care, his routines, his pediatric appointments, his development, which her own attorney told me later was exactly the right thing to do and had made the process cleaner. I was grateful to her in a way that I found difficult to fully express, and I told her so on one of my Knoxville visits. She said that Liam was easy to love and that she would do whatever was best for him. And I believed her completely. The guardian ad litem was a man named Douglas Webb, no relation to my doctor. Webb, a quiet and observant person who visited both Patricia's home and my home in Clarkton over the course of several weeks. He spent time with Liam at both locations, watching how the boy interacted with each of us, asking questions that were simple on the surface and careful underneath. He also spoke with Frank, with Ruth, with several of my longtime patients who had offered character statements, and with the family court social worker assigned to the case. I drove to Knoxville twice a week during those 3 months, sometimes more. The visits had developed their own rhythm by then, the blocks, the coffee, the quiet conversation with Patricia while Liam played. But there were new elements too. I started taking Liam to the park near Patricia's building on Saturday mornings, the 2 of us walking the path around the small pond. Liam stopping every few feet to examine something that had caught his attention. A beetle, a particular stone, the way the light moved on the water. He asked questions the way Owen had asked questions on those fence-line walks, with the same relentless curiosity. And I answered each one as carefully and honestly as a man answers a 4-year-old who wants to know why ducks float and whether fish are cold and what happens to leaves after they fall. I did not think about the resemblance too directly, but I was aware of it. It was there, in the background of every Saturday morning walk, like a piece of music playing in another room. In July, the court date was set. Catherine Bowles told me the hearing would be brief. The evidence was clear. The guardian ad litem's report was favorable, and there was no opposition from either parent's legal representation. Owen had not contested the petition. Sandra had submitted a written statement through her attorney, saying that she believed Liam's placement with his grandfather was in the boy's best interest and that she did not oppose it. I read that statement twice. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer with the 11 pages of legal pad from October. The hearing was on a Wednesday morning in late July, in a family courtroom that was smaller and quieter than the criminal courtroom had been. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, a judge named Calloway who reviewed the file with the practiced efficiency of someone who had approved many of these and understood that what looked like paperwork on his desk was someone's entire life on the other side of it. He asked me 2 questions directly. He asked whether I understood the responsibilities I was taking on. I said I did. He asked whether I intended to support Liam's relationship with his parents to the extent that was appropriate and safe as circumstances evolved. I said I did. He signed the order. Catherine Bowles shook my hand in the hallway afterward. She said congratulations, and I thanked her. And then I stood in that hallway for a moment by myself, the fluorescent light humming overhead, the sound of the building going about its business around me, and I let the weight of what had just happened settle into me fully. I was Liam's guardian, legally, formally, on paper and in fact. The boy who had been building towers on Patricia's living room floor for the past 9 months was coming home with me to Clarkton. I called Frank from the parking lot. He said good. Just that. Good. It was exactly the right word. Then I went back inside to get Liam. We drove back to Clarkton on a Thursday afternoon in late July. Liam strapped into the car seat I had installed the week before, a small bag of his things in the trunk, and a stuffed bear named Gerald, named, as far as I could determine, after no one in particular, held firmly in both hands. Patricia had packed his things carefully. She had also, without being asked, included a small photo album she had put together, pictures of Liam from the past several months, pictures of Sandra from before everything happened, a few older photographs that I didn't fully understand the origin of, but that I understood the intention behind. She handed it to me at the door when I came to collect him, and she said that when he was older and had questions, she hoped those pictures would help answer some of them. I told her they would. I told her that she was welcome in Liam's life for as long as she wanted to be, and that I meant that without qualification. She nodded. Then she knelt down to Liam's level and said goodbye to him in the particular way that women who love children say goodbye fully, without holding back, making sure he felt it completely. Liam hugged her neck and said he would miss her dog. She laughed. It was a real laugh, and it helped. The drive back took just under an hour. For the first 20 minutes, Liam asked questions about the highway, about the trucks, about where exactly we were going, and whether there would be a yard. I told him there was a yard with a very large oak tree and a creek at the back of the property that had interesting rocks in it. He considered this information seriously and appeared to find it acceptable. Then he fell asleep. The way children fall asleep in cars, suddenly and completely, his head tipped to one side, Gerald the bear still in his hands. I drove the rest of the way in the particular quiet of a car with a sleeping child in it, which is a different quiet from any other kind. It has a quality of trust in it the unconscious trust of a small person who has decided, without deliberation, that they are safe enough to let go. I had not felt that specific quality of quiet in my car before. I found that it suited me. We came down Birch Street and left on County Road 12, past the Henderson's farm with the white fence and the horse at the corner. I had driven this road 10,000 times. I had driven it the Tuesday evening when two men appeared at my windows out of the early dark. I had driven it every day since, deliberately, without changing the route. I drove it now with a sleeping 4-year-old in the back seat, and the road felt different than it ever had. Not because it had changed, but because I had. I pulled into the driveway. The oak out front was in full summer green, heavy and still in the July heat. I sat in the car for a moment after cutting the engine, looking at the house. The house where Carol and I had raised Owen, where I had lived alone for 8 years, where the tea tray had sat on the low table between two rocking chairs on an October afternoon that had changed everything. Then Liam woke up. He looked out the window at the oak tree. He said that tree was magnificent. I told him he had no idea. We went inside. The first weeks were an education. I had raised a child before, of course. But I had raised a child 30 years ago, with Carol beside me, when I was in my 30s and had the particular energy and adaptability of a younger man. Raising a child at 60, or more precisely, becoming a primary caregiver at 60 is a different undertaking. Not worse, just different. The energy required is of a different kind, and you draw on different reserves. Liam woke early. He was up by 6 most mornings, sometimes earlier, and he came into the kitchen with Gerald under his arm and stood at the counter watching me make coffee with the focused attention of a person observing an important procedure. He had questions about the coffee maker. He had questions about most things. I answered them all. We established routines quickly, which I think children need more than adults sometimes recognize. Breakfast at the table, always. A walk after breakfast, usually along the back of the property where the creek ran. Liam collected rocks from that creek with a seriousness of purpose that I found both admirable and occasionally exhausting, given that the rocks then needed to be carried home and given prominent positions in the garden. Frank came for dinner on Thursdays. Ruth came for coffee on Sunday mornings and brought pastries from the bakery on Main Street. And she and Liam developed a rapport within approximately 2 visits that involved a complicated and apparently very funny ongoing joke about Gerald the bear that I was never fully able to follow. Dr. Webb. My Dr. Webb. Anita became Liam's pediatrician, which felt right and also a little circular in a way that made me quietly grateful for the smallness of Clarkton. The town itself received Liam with the particular warmth that small towns extend to children, which is genuine and enveloping and occasionally overwhelming. People at the diner knew his name within a week. The woman at the hardware store kept a jar of lollipops on the counter that Liam considered a personal arrangement. The Henderson boy from the farm down the road, who was 6, came by one afternoon, and the two of them spent 3 hours doing something with sticks in the backyard that appeared to involve complex rules that neither of them could fully articulate. I watched all of this from the porch, or the kitchen window, or the armchair in the living room. And what I felt underneath the tiredness, underneath the daily logistics of meals and baths and bedtimes and the particular negotiations that 4-year-olds conduct with great conviction and limited leverage. What I felt was something I had not expected to feel so fully or so soon. I felt necessary. I had felt necessary for 32 years in the practice. The necessity of a doctor in a small town is real and constant, and I had never taken it lightly. But this was a different kind of necessity. This was the necessity of being the specific person that a specific small person needed to be steady for. Not because of professional training or community obligation, but because of love. The simple, foundational, non-negotiable love of a grandfather for a child who has no one else in the world who loves him in exactly that way. It reorganized things. I had wondered, in the months between October and July, what retirement would feel like once the legal proceedings were over and the structure of the crisis was no longer organizing my days. I had wondered if I would rattle around in the big house without the practice to go to, without the shape that work gives to a life. I did not rattle. There was no room for it. Liam filled the house the way children fill houses completely, in every room, at every hour, with a thoroughness that left no space unfilled. I was tired in the evenings in a way I had not been tired in years. It was a good tired, the kind that comes from being fully used by a day rather than merely occupying one. There were hard moments. I want to be honest about that too, because a story that leaves out the hard moments is not a true story. There were nights when Liam woke up crying for his mother. Not every night, not even most nights, but enough nights that I learned the particular sound of it and what it required. I would go to his room and sit on the edge of the bed and let him cry for as long as he needed to, and then I would talk to him quietly about Sandra, about the fact that his mother loved him, that she was going through something difficult, that she thought about him every day. I told him these things because they were true. Sandra did love him. Whatever else she had done, that was true. And Liam deserved to know it. Those were the moments when I missed Carol most acutely. Not because I couldn't manage without her. I had learned to manage without her over 8 years of learning. But because she would have known exactly what to say to a 4-year-old crying in the dark. And I was always working from first principles, feeling my way through it, hoping that steadiness and honesty were enough, even when the words weren't quite right. I think they were mostly enough. Children are more forgiving of imperfect words than adults are, provided the presence behind the words is real. There were also moments with Owen that I had not anticipated navigating so soon. His attorney sent a letter in August, formal and careful, asking whether I would be open to Liam having supervised phone contact with Owen. I sat with that letter for a week. I talked to Catherine Bowles about the legal parameters. I talked to Frank about his read on it. And then I sat alone in the kitchen one evening and thought about it as honestly as I could. Owen was Liam's father. He would be Liam's father for the rest of both their lives, regardless of what a courthouse had decided or what a father's heart had been put through. Liam was 4 years old now, but he would be 14 and 24 and 34, and at each of those ages he would have to make his own accounting of who his father was, and what had happened, and what it meant. I could not make that accounting for him. What I could do was make sure that when he was ready to have it, he had enough honest information to make it clearly. I wrote back to Owen's attorney and said that I was open to supervised phone contact, on the condition that it was conducted through a family counselor who could monitor the interactions and support Liam through them. I said it was not a punitive condition, it was a protective one. Owen's attorney agreed. The first call happened on a Saturday morning in September. I sat in the kitchen while Liam sat at the table with the phone, and I heard Owen's voice coming through the speaker, thinner than I remembered, more careful, stripped of the ease it used to carry. He asked Liam how he was. Liam told him, at considerable length, about the creek rocks and Gerald the bear and the Henderson boy and the lollipops at the hardware store. Owen listened. I could hear him listening. At one point, he said that sounded like a good life, and his voice did something on those words that I chose not to examine too closely. After the call ended, Liam went back to his blocks without particular ceremony. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the phone for a moment. Then I got up and made lunch. That was how it went. One day and then the next, each one carrying its own weight and its own small gifts. The two things always arriving together the way they do in a life that is being genuinely lived rather than merely endured. I was not the man I had been in September of the previous year, 2 months from retirement, believing that the biggest challenge ahead was learning to fill the days without work. That man had been living in a house full of things he had not fully examined. He had been comfortable in a way that had cost him something without his knowing it. The man I was now had fewer certainties and more clarity. He knew what his son was capable of and what his own blindness had cost him. He knew what fear felt like in a concrete room in the Tennessee dark, and what it felt like to hold on anyway. He knew what it was to sit on a courthouse step in May and feel a door close and not know yet what came next. And he knew what it was to hear a 4-year-old boy call a large oak tree magnificent and understand, completely and without reservation, exactly what the word meant. Summer turned to fall again. The oak out front went red and gold the way it always did, right on schedule, indifferent and magnificent. Liam noticed the change over the course of several mornings. The gradual shift in color that a child who spends time looking at things notices in a way that adults, moving faster through their days, often miss. He pointed it out to me one morning from the porch, holding his coffee cup of warm apple juice the way I held my coffee, standing beside me in the early light. He said the tree was changing. I told him that was what trees did in autumn, that they let go of what they had been holding all summer, and that the letting go was what made the color. He thought about that for a moment. Then he asked if it hurt the tree. I told him I didn't think so. I told him I thought the tree had learned that letting go was part of what it was, and that it did it every year without fear because it knew that spring would come back around. He nodded slowly, with the gravity of a child receiving information that he intends to keep. We stood there on the porch together for a while, the two of us, looking at the tree. I thought about the year behind us, about the October Saturday that had started it, the tea tray and the 2 cups, and the 4 seconds on a porch that had changed the shape of everything, about the legal pad with 11 pages, about the concrete room and the folding chair and the bare bulb, about the courtroom in March and the sentencing in May and the guardianship hearing in July, about all the miles of highway between Clarkton and Knoxville and the particular quiet of a car with a sleeping child in it, about Carol's chair by the window and the way the lamp fell across the pages of a book on an ordinary evening, about what she had said about the hunger in Owen all those years ago, and about how right she had been, and how much I wished I had listened more carefully, about Owen himself standing for sentencing with his back to me, the movement of his shoulders when the judge said 12 years. I had not made peace with what he had done. I was not certain that peace was the right destination for that particular journey, or that I would reach it in whatever time I had left. But I had made a kind of separate peace with the fact that he was my son, that he would always be my son, that the love I had for him did not disappear because he had betrayed it, that it had simply changed shape into something more painful and more honest than it had been before. Love that has been tested and has survived the test is not the same love it was before the test. It is something harder and quieter and more durable. I was learning to live with that kind of love. Frank came for dinner that Thursday evening, the way he came every Thursday. We ate at the kitchen table, pot roast, which Liam had declared his favorite food 3 weeks prior and which I was now making with some regularity. Frank and Liam had their own dynamic by then, a careful and mutual respect that I found genuinely touching. Frank talked to Liam the way a good man talks to a small child, directly, without condescension, as though what the boy said mattered and deserved a real answer. Liam, for his part, had apparently decided that Frank was trustworthy, which in a 4-year-old is both a considered judgment and a complete commitment. After dinner, While Liam was in the bath, Frank and I sat on the porch with our coffee. The evening was cool, and the air had that edge that comes to Tennessee in October, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. Frank asked me how I was doing. Not in the way people ask when they want a reassuring answer. In the way he asked, which was the way he asked everything, plainly, expecting the truth. I told him I was doing better than I had any right to expect. I told him I was tired in the right ways, and uncertain in ways that felt honest rather than frightening. I told him that most mornings, when Liam came into the kitchen with Gerald under his arm and stood at the counter watching me make coffee, I felt something that I could only describe as gratitude. Not the performed kind, not the kind you say because it sounds right, but the deep and specific gratitude of a man who understands, in his bones, how easily things could have gone another way. Frank looked out at the yard for a moment. Then he said that was about the best answer a man could give to that question. We sat there a while longer. The coffee cooled in our cups, and neither of us minded. The October dark settled in around the house, and the oak tree, and the yard. And inside the house, a 4-year-old boy was getting out of his bath and putting on his pajamas, and getting ready to ask the questions he always asked before sleep. Why is the moon sometimes round and sometimes not? Where do birds go when it rains? Will I still be here in the morning? I always told him yes. You will still be here in the morning. I will still be here in the morning. We will both be here. That was the only promise I knew for certain I could keep. And I made it every night without hesitation. There is something I have come to understand in the years since that October Saturday. It is not a lesson I would have chosen. It did not come cheap, but it came clearly, the way the most important things tend to come, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulated weight of many ordinary days, each one adding a small piece to the picture, until the picture was finally complete enough to see. The thing I have come to understand is this: you cannot protect the people you love by refusing to see them clearly. The love that looks away, that files the difficult things under warmth and family, and the wish for things to be simple, is not a lesser love. It comes from a real place, but it does not protect. It only delays. And what it delays has a way of arriving eventually, with considerably more force than it would have carried if you had looked at it honestly from the beginning. I had loved Owen without seeing him clearly for 34 years. I had loved my life without examining it honestly for nearly as long. It took a cup of tea on an autumn porch to make me stop and look at both things directly. I would not recommend the method, but I am grateful. In the complicated way that I am grateful for most things now, for what the looking revealed. I am 61 years old. I am retired from medicine, but not from living a distinction that took me longer to understand than it should have. I have a grandson who collects creek rocks and talks to bears, and finds the entire world magnificent. I have a friend who comes for dinner on Thursdays and asks the right questions and accepts honest answers. I have a house that is no longer too large for one man, because it is no longer occupied by one man. I have a chair by the window where Carol used to read. On the evenings when Liam is asleep and the house is quiet and the lamp is on and the book is open in my lap, I sometimes feel her in that chair, the way you feel a thing you cannot see but know is real. I do not try to explain it. I just feel it. And I am grateful for that, too. The oak tree out front will go bare in a few more weeks. It will stand gray and still through the winter, the way it always has. The way it stood when Carol was alive, and when she wasn't. Through all the winters this house has seen. And in the spring, it will come back, the way it always does, tentative at first, a faint green at the branch tips, and then fully and completely itself. I am counting on that. We both are. If this story found its way to you today, I want to thank you for listening. There is something remarkable about a stranger's willingness to sit with another person's truth for a little while, and I do not take that lightly. If it moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you have carried, I hope you will share it with someone who might need to hear it too. And if you have not already, a like or a subscription means more than you might think. It helps stories like this one find the people who need them. God bless you. I will see you next time.